Congressional candidate Ryan Greene calls for greater economic diversity in our state.
It doesn't matter if you are the vice president's daughter. You're not going to tell Walmart what energy products they can buy.
The future of U.S. foreign policy.
The central issue facing American foreign policy, it really isn't terrorism, it isn't some of the disagreements across the candidates, it's really looking at putting our own house in order.
Good evening and welcome to this edition of Wyoming Signatures. The general election is around the corner. Wyoming residents have an opportunity to send a new congressperson to Washington. Will it be Liz Cheney or Ryan Greene? We asked both candidates for interviews. The Greene campaign responded by inviting us to their family business headquarters in Rock Springs. That's where Patrick Wolfenbarger talked to the candidate about issues vital to our state.
Can you tell us, for those who may not be familiar with you, your background, why you're running for Congress?
Oh, sure. Yeah, my name's Ryan Greene, and I'm 33, from Rock Springs. Born and raised here in Rock Springs. Been here my entire life. Graduated from Rock Springs High School in 2000, and after college, I married my high school sweetheart, Lindsay. We've been together for 12 years, and we've got 2 little kids. I've got a 10-year-old son and a 7-year-old daughter. Basically, you know, in 1998, my dad, we started a family business with 1 welding truck. We sold everything we had but the kitchen sink to get the business up and running. And it was a family business. My mom did the books. My brothers and I, we swept the shop and cleaned the tools, and my dad did the weldings. But over the next 18 years, the business grew. And we grew from 1 employee to over 250 employees and a presence in 3 different states. We have a presence in Pittsburgh, we have a presence in North Dakota, and of course our headquarters is here in Rock Springs. And so my role with the company grew along with the business. I started out as a roustabout and then went to a welder, to a project manager, and today I'm the operations director for Greene's Energy Services. And it's an energy services company, and so what that means is we provide labor and equipment to the oil and gas fields, to the coal mines, to the fertilizer plants and the renewable sector. And a lot of people ask me, they say, you know, why did you get into this race? And really for me, you know, it's personal. It's because, you know, this is our 3rd bust in 60 years. And we're a small company. So I know all of our employees. I know their names. I know their families. I know their stories. I know their struggles. And when this last bust hit, like so many, you know, Wyoming businesses, we had to let some good folks go. And, you know, I was the guy that had to do that. So I had to call these folks into my office and tell them that because of Wyoming's economy, they no longer have a job here. You know, I remember one time I had to let a guy go, a friend of mine, and then I had to coach his kid that night at baseball. So the policies that are rolling out of D.C., the decisions, they affect me personally. I see the outcomes of them. And so, you know, if we don't start talking about the issues and start, you know, advancing the conversation, then I believe we're accepting another bust in 60 years. Or I'm sorry, in 20 years.
So you have a challenge as a Democratic candidate in Wyoming, which is heavily leans to the Republican side. How are you trying to meet the challenges to get your name out, to get these issues discussed that you are advocating?
Yeah, it's not an easy task. We've got a long uphill battle, but we're going to fight every day. And we need to get in as many places and talk to as many folks as possible. But Wyoming will elect a Democrat. 3 of our last 5 governors have been Democrats, and they've done a great job balancing energy development with conservation. And it's got to be the right kind of Democrat. And I believe I have those same characteristics as Governor Dave Friedenthal and Mike Sullivan. So it's an uphill battle, but ever since the primary, our strategy was to pivot and go after Republican voters. But now they're coming to us. They know I support the Second Amendment, and they know that I work in the energy industry, that it's not a campaign stop for me, but these are customers, they're clients, they're friends and neighbors. So they know that they'll have a friend in Washington, which I believe we so desperately need.
Now, you talked about economic issues. Economic diversity is real important to the state on a state level. What can you see on the federal level that Congress can do, what you can do?
This has already been done before. There's some eastern states that have came together and they formed a regional development program. It's a partnership between the federal, state, and local governments. And what they did was they were able to successfully bring their tax dollars back into their states for things like infrastructure and healthcare, export, and manufacturing. Now these taxes, this tax money, has been put aside for these projects. And Wyoming can participate in those programs to bring healthcare and infrastructure into our state, because I believe this is a great state to start a business. You know, it's a tax-friendly state. It's a great state to bring in new industries, but it starts with modern infrastructure. You know, I was up in Fremont County the other day, and I talked with a gentleman. He was welding, and he got a piece of metal in his eye, and the surgery they couldn't perform there in Riverton, so he had to drive 2 hours to Casper. But by the time he got to Casper, he lost his eye. So when we're talking about bringing industries into Wyoming, you know, we've got to have good, solid health care for these rural communities. You know, infrastructure and communications is another big one. We were doing an interview on the eastern part of the state, and the lady who was conducting the interview, she told us that sometimes late at night, if she's trying to upload her story to the server and another member of the staff is uploading pictures or a story, the server crashes. So she has to drive 25 miles to upload her work. Now, we take this stuff for granted, but these things need to be in place in order for us to attract new industries into our state.
There are proposals for how we can use our public lands better. Some concepts include selling public lands as a way to generate income for the state that's needed in these times of reduced revenues. What do you look at in these proposals that you want to react to?
Yeah, well, I strongly disagree with the state transfer of public lands. When we take a look at our number 2 economic driver here in Wyoming is tourism, hunting, angling, and recreation use of our public lands. So from an economic standpoint, they're very valuable to Wyoming. But from a quality of life standpoint, they're even more valuable to Wyoming. You know, we hunt, we fish, we camp. So I stand against the state takeover of public land. We've seen this time and time again. We turn our hunting grounds into private homes. We sell the land, especially when we can't pay for it. And I believe that's an attack on our freedom, is trying to take away the lands and sell these lands, because once it's gone, our access is gone for good. So I would fight the state takeover. And again, you know, when we're talking about being in an economic crunch like we are now, with being a $680 million shortfall from the state of Wyoming, we don't have the money to maintain these lands. We don't have the funds to, you know, keep the trails open or fight an unpredictable cost in wildfires. So what happens is we sell these lands and we lose our access. So I'm strongly against the state takeover. I support the agreement that we have in place now, and that's always worked since 1890.
You talked about some proposals that of joint planning. What are other areas? You know, higher education, the workforce seems to be a major issue, and that the state is struggling with right now. How can the federal government help?
We need to take a look at what we can do to retrain and reposition some of these out-of-work miners and things like that. Now, again, this has been done. In the early 80s, when the uranium mines closed in Jeffrey City, the federal government stepped in and they provided tax dollars and funds to send these miners back to school. and they could learn, a trade in electrical work or welding or mechanic or carpentry. I had a friend that went through this program. He was laid off as a miner. They retrained him as a welder, and he worked for the next 35 years in Wyoming's economy. So these are things that we could look at bringing in. Now we look at the coal industry, and we know that the demand for coal is down, and we've laid off 600 of our friends and neighbors. In the president's budget, there was the Power Plus plan, and this was money that is set aside to help communities that have been impacted by the loss of coal jobs. But again, Wyoming doesn't want to look at that if it's tied to this president. And so, we send a statement that it's his fault, but we're not willing to help you. And so I think that type of thinking, we've got to set that aside. We need to quit reacting to things, and I think, start responding to these. The Integrated Test Center up there in Gillette, I believe it's a great idea, but again, I think it's a decade too late. If Wyoming's the #1 coal producer in the United States, we should lead this effort, especially with the University of Wyoming. So when we talk about economic diversity, I think we need to do it inside the energy industry and outside the energy industry. We talked about outside the energy industry with bringing new industries in, and to add on to that, we should stop turning away business. Tesla put out for bid a gigafactory that they wanted to build for their cars, and they put it out to 6 states, and Wyoming didn't even bid on it. We didn't even submit a bid. But inside the energy industry, we need to take a look at diversifying that as well, because the reality is the market is driving the demand for coal. Coal's not going anywhere. It powers 1/3 of our nation. But 150 countries are investing in cleaner energy. There's a pledge out there. It's called the RE100. And what it is 58 of the world's largest companies have pledged to go 100% renewable, most of them by 2020. And so these are companies like Walmart and Facebook and Starbucks, Google, Nike, Johnson & Johnson, major companies. And so it's critically important that we understand this, especially our next congressman, because it doesn't matter if you are the vice president's daughter, you're not going to tell Walmart what energy products they can buy. But the good news is Wyoming, we are blessed with all of them. We have wind and solar and coal and natural gas and uranium. We have it all here. But we need to sell the market what it's buying. And we need a congressman that's willing to support all of our energy producers.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Ryan.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
The Cheney campaign has not yet responded to our request for an interview. Well, looking at the presidential race, there are big differences in the positions and experiences of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, especially in terms of foreign affairs. Political scientist and director of the International Studies Center at the University of Wyoming, Jean Garrison, recently moderated an international panel of experts on the subject. She shared her observations with Erlanda Jacinto.
What are the differences between a Trump administration and a Clinton administration's foreign policy, and how do they fit in the traditional United States policies?
Well, let me start with the second part of your question, and that is that post-Cold War, we had a series of presidents who were pretty similar, and I would even put George W. Bush in that list. When you look at the second term of George W. Bush, you have American multilateralism, belief in American exceptionalism, trying to promote American interests and American values around the world. And in general, there's an awful lot of continuity in American foreign policy. The other part of that, however, is that we've had divided government for a good 25 plus years now. And that means that any president who's trying to operate in foreign policy or make decisions has to bring along the Congress. And so anybody who becomes president, whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, will have to face that divided government. And that might be pretty difficult for both of them. Donald Trump is being panned as being very different. And certainly one of the difficulties in pegging a Donald Trump administration foreign policy is that he says a lot of contradictory things. He's beginning to have some pretty standard messages about promoting American interests, putting America first. And then at the same time, he'll talk about supporting allies, but he'll also, in a sense, get into Twitter wars with allies. So there's a little bit of an unpredictability to Trump, and that's where some of the concern has come from the American foreign policy establishment. Hillary Clinton will be a continuation of Barack Obama's foreign policies, which I would note is also pretty much a continuation of George W. Bush's second term foreign policy. So not a lot of difference out of Hillary Clinton multilateralism, promotion of American exceptionalism, I've already said that, but pretty tried and true American interests, promoting American interests. I think both candidates talk about promoting American interests, however.
Which one would be more successful in uniting the Congress?
Oh, well, probably Hillary Clinton, simply because she's been a senator. She has relationships with members of the Senate and some in the House that go back to her time in the Congress. She is coming out of, she's considered a much more standard actor, and she's a hard worker and has that reputation. So she has those relationships. And Donald Trump doesn't have those relationships. But a president's success has an awful lot to do with who he or she puts in office with them in terms of advisors. So it would really be the responsibility of the foreign policy team, whether it's Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the advisors on the White House staff, to build those relationships and to act on behalf of whoever is president.
One of the major concerns is terrorism. Who would be more adequate for this concern?
This
Or
is,
there's a fear that Trump would be trigger happy.
yeah, I think that oddly enough, in some ways, I think there's a difference in style between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I think Donald Trump likes to say some things he'd like to do that he'd go after, and within the first 30 days, he has a plan and he'd go after ISIS. And he would have to face some of the concerns people would have about boots on the ground. Hillary Clinton has talked about no boots on the ground, but both of them would be trying to find the most effective policy to address challenges to American security. So I think in some ways, terrorism has, sometimes terrorism and the politics of fear take over a campaign. A lot of that's actually faded in the last several weeks just because there are character issues that are being discussed on both sides. But I'm not willing to say who would be most effective because honestly, I think they'd be pretty similar.
Why would they be similar?
Well, they'd be similar because there's only so many things you can do in order to be effective. I think Donald Trump would figure out that you can't simply say you're going to bomb ISIS into the ground when you think about the collateral damage that would take place. Collateral damage means human beings, and when you have ISIS fighters next to civilians, there's an awful lot of unacceptable loss that you would have. So there could be a backlash there. So I think anybody who is coming into office, particularly when they're not experienced yet, need to be listening to their advisors and the military advisors and some of the intelligence officials that would be coming in and talking about what are the effective opportunities. Hillary Clinton would argue that she already knows, given her experience, she already knows some of those answers and in some ways might move more quickly. But I mean, terrorism is a very tough policy issue. And in all honesty, it's not the biggest challenge facing the United States. It just, again, politics of fear, it gets elevated because dramatic events. There are reasons, and I think very recently we've had the 15-year anniversary of 9/11, so it's back in our minds again, and that makes sense.
Is immigration another one that's a politics of fear?
I think, it depends on the perspective. I think there's an awful lot of platitudes, an awful lot of rhetoric being thrown around about immigration. There's a lot of, frankly, falsehoods being said about how many refugees are getting into the United States. It's pretty clear that the U.S. government is concerned about the nature of people who immigrate to the United States. That's why there's a 2-year vetting process for people coming in. There is a difference in policy, however, with these two candidates. Hillary Clinton wants to bring in tens of thousands following UN recommendations. She is coming from the perspective that it's the United States has partial responsibility in creating some of the refugee flows and challenges, and it's part about being in solidarity with your allies in Europe. Donald Trump has talked about putting up a fence to keep illegal immigrants out. That's a very different kind of immigrant, of course. It has nothing to do with terrorism. It's about illegal immigration in that context. But it all gets conflated and put together. He's a very different choice for voters on the immigration issue.
From both candidates, which one would be more effective in fighting terrorism?
It's a really thorny problem for both candidates. They both have to think about cooperating with our with our allies, and it's not simply a matter of going into the Middle East and thinking about bombing them. So we need to be thinking about having prudent policies and working with allies. So it's a very difficult question for both candidates.
What are the issues facing American foreign policy?
I think the central issue facing American foreign policy, it really isn't terrorism, it isn't some of the disagreements across the candidates, it's really looking at putting our own house in order. We have a huge rising debt, we have schools which have severe challenges. We need to be thinking about putting our own house in order, and that's the means to promote American interests and to make us an effective policy actor on the world stage.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Garrison.
Thank you for having me.
It seems terrorism is at an all-time high in Europe, yet studying abroad has never been more popular. So how do we keep people safe if they want to study there? Our Rachel Wagoner found out from the Acting Director of International Programs at the University of Wyoming, Mary Katherine Scott.
Mary Katherine, thank you for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Perfect. All right. So terrorism abroad is all over the news. How do you determine if a country is safe for students here at the university to travel to?
Safe is a really big term. What we do at the University of Wyoming is through a presidential directive that was established in 2014, we have a committee of different people from the University of Wyoming, including myself as Director from International Programs, the Dean of Students, the Chief Risk Officer, as well as 2 faculty members who have broad experience teaching, living, working, studying overseas. And this committee of individuals looks at requests from students, especially if they're traveling to a country that is deemed by the Department of State as having some kind of travel warning or advisory. And we'll look at those requests to make sure that the country is safe enough to travel to so that the student can carry out their research or teaching proposals. But really, where we determine if a country is safe or a good place for a student to gain an international experience is really by monitoring very closely those Department of State warnings that come through, as well as through the OSAC reports, which is the Overseas Security Advisory Council, again, a federal institution. So we look very closely at that, as well as coupling that with any kind of information from trusted news sources. And together with this committee, we make those determinations.
Okay, so what countries are no travel for the university?
Right now, there are a number of countries that we are not recommending travel to, particularly places in the Middle East, some of those, as well as some African nations and other places. So what this committee does, this International Travel Review Committee does, is we make a recommendation to the provost, that is the Vice President of Academic Affairs, and ultimately the provost makes the final decision as to whether a student can travel to a warned country or a high-risk country, that is a place where there is either some kind of natural disaster that makes infrastructure not as good as it normally is, or in places where there's escalating violence.
Okay, so if a student really wants to travel to a no-travel country, how can they kind of push that to want to go there and be allowed to?
Well, certainly for the student side, because of this presidential directive, if the request comes through our committee, which through the presidential directive it needs to, and the committee makes a recommendation to the provost, and the provost says, I'm not allowing travel at this time, technically the student should not be traveling through the University of Wyoming. And that is to say, we have a number of international insurance regulations in place that we can cover students for their international travels and other experiences overseas. And without the provost recommending or allowing that travel, the student really should be thinking carefully about whether to go. Now, if it's for personal travel, if it's not related to their academic studies, that's another matter, and we have, that's not our area. That's not what we're recommending or approving.
Okay, if a student is in a country that is affected by terrorism or a natural disaster, what's the process for getting and contacting with them and ensuring they're safe?
That's a great question. And we have a whole process on our website, which is the International Programs Office website, as well as our Study Abroad office. We have a step-by-step list of contact people. I'm on that contact list, as well as my exchange coordinator, Ruth Shepard, as well as the Chief Risk Officer, Laura Betzold. A number of us are listed on there so that students know who to contact in case of an emergency. And because we monitor those travel advisories and warnings through OSAC as well as the State Department so closely. We get updates constantly, about 3 or 4 times a day. So we always know what's going on very soon after it happens, and we'll reach out to students as well who are in affected areas, and if need be, we'll bring them home through the process of evacuation with our international insurance provider. This is why it's so important for UW students who are in locations on UW official business, so studies and research and internships, to keep us informed and also to register with that international insurance coverage that UW provides.
And are you in contact with the families at the same time?
Well, through FERPA, our communication primarily is with the student, but certainly, families often want to have more information, and so we do try to provide as much information as we can on our website, so they can have updates as well.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
One of the most effective voices for conservation in Wyoming passed away last month. Tom Bell founded the High Country News and the Wyoming Outdoor Council. He also served on the Wyoming Environmental Quality Council for more than a decade. Always passionate and inspirational, Tom Bell was 90 years young. Well, this takes us to the end of our show tonight. Until next time, I'm Mary Young, wishing you happy trails for everyone here at UWTV. Good night.